My guest today is Eric Beinhocker, Professor of Practice in Public Policy at the Blavatnik School of Government, University of Oxford, and the founder and executive director of the Institute for New Economic Thinking at the university's Oxford Martin School. Eric is the author of numerous academic articles and books, including The Origin of Wealth, Evolution, Complexity, and the Radical Remaking of Economies. In our conversation, Eric and I contrast traditional economics, also called neoclassical theory, with new economics, also called complexity economics. We explore the policy implications of these different economic theories, discussing topics ranging from aggressive growth strategies to complexity catastrophes in digital economies. I hope you enjoy our discussion. Welcome to the podcast. I'm very happy to be here. It's funny because we're going to talk about networks today, and we do indeed know quite a lot of people in common. So if we were to draw a network of all of our relationships, this will make for quite an interesting one. What I've done for the conversation is that I have divided my questions into three different parts. First, I want to talk about the divide between complexity economics and traditional economics. Then we'll talk about technologies. And finally, we'll move more to the policy world, which is where I'm most comfortable. So obviously, I wanted to go that way. But starting with the divide between complexity and traditional economics, let me start with a general question. And of course, those are the hardest to answer. You have written several papers on the distinction between neoclassical economic theory and complexity economics, or as you put it, between traditional economics and new economics. Can you give us 2 or 3 very concrete examples where, when it comes to predicting an economic phenomenon or reacting to one, the choice between using traditional or new economic will actually make a big difference?
Sure. And thanks for having me on your podcast, Thibault. It's a pleasure to be with you. Just before I talk about the predictions that this different theory makes and a few case examples, just for the listeners to make clear of what I mean by the difference between neoclassical and complexity or new economics. There are 4 points that I would highlight as distinctions between these two bodies of theory. Neoclassical economics views the economy as an equilibrium system, a system that tends to a state of rest or stasis. Complexity economics views the system as dynamic and constantly changing. Complexity economics also views the economy as an evolutionary system, where new technologies and institutions are constantly being innovative and evolving, and those in turn change how the system itself functions. It takes human behavior seriously instead of this abstract theory of rational, farsighted, strictly selfish people. It incorporates modern behavioral science and a richer, more empirically based view of human behavior. Complexity economics views the economy as an emergent system, emerging from bottom-up interactions of people and networks and technologies and institutions, that those lead to the macro patterns we see, like business cycles, unemployment, inflation, climate change, and so on. Whereas classical economics takes a more top-down view and actually just views things as kind of linearly adding up, that there's no interaction or emergent effects. So those are just kind of the key points of difference. And the complexity theory is based on a much more empirical and realistic view of the economy, whereas neoclassical economics was developed as a kind of abstract mathematical theory that even its main developers, figures like Ken Arrow, noted that it was almost more of a theoretical exercise and didn't actually describe the real world. So those are the key differences between these two bodies of thought. Now, complexity economics is still relatively young, had its origins probably, I would say, in the 70s and 80s. A lot of the figures around it were associated with the Santa Fe Institute, and it's been developing ever since and has really started to mature and actually get to the stage where it could make some predictions about the world and say some things that are very different from more traditional theories, and we can empirically test them. Offer briefly 3 case examples. Each of these cases were led by other guests you've had on the podcast.
Very good.
in their research. The first one was in the financial crisis of 2008. Traditional theories really struggled to explain that crisis. Bubbles, booms, and crashes just aren't supposed to happen in the efficient markets of traditional theory. Figures like Stefan Turner, and my colleague Don Farmer, and others developed a set of models and explanations showing the crisis as a kind of network phenomena, a contagion of problems between networks of banks and structural instabilities in the system that led to this, emergent macro phenomena of a huge crash. And, they did a series of studies and papers which both provided better explanations of the crash, were more empirically validated, but also provided some interesting recommendations to policymakers on how the system could be reformed to make it more robust and less fragile and subject to these kinds of crashes. A second area more recently was around COVID. My colleague, Don Farmer, and he describes this work in his recent book, he and his colleagues built a model of how the pandemic was interacting with the economy. And this was also a network agent-based model. And they made a set of predictions back early in the days of the pandemic about how the economy would behave and react. And a couple of years later, they went back and looked at how did those predictions do versus the standard models by folks like the Bank of England or other major providers of models. And they beat the pants off them. Their predictions were much better. And impressively, not just at an aggregate level for things like GDP and employment effects of the pandemic, but also at individual industry sectors and occupations. And the reason for this was they were taking advantage of all the kind of detailed micro data that is now available. And again, looking at the networks of interactions and supply chains and labor markets and so on. Third and final example is climate change. We've had, for decades, a series of models based on neoclassical ideas in the tradition of Bill Nordhaus, who won the Nobel Prize for his work on climate change. The empirical predictions of those models have been terrible. They've been making predictions and forecasts for about 40 years now, so you can go back and look at the record. And the record is they've gotten it wrong very, very consistently. My colleagues at INET Oxford have built a series of models, particularly looking at the evolution in technology progress in clean energy and looking at why that's been driving down the cost of clean energy in a very dramatic fashion. Doan made some predictions about that from his models way back in 2010 and recently went back and looked at how those did, and they did very well. In the more near term, we've been using those models to assess how the energy system is likely to evolve, and it looks like that is tracking as well. Those models also have very big implications for policymakers, and in particular, shifting policy away from the idea of a carbon price, which was the main recommendation of the Nordhaus style of modeling, toward the kind of industrial policy that we've seen more recently with the Inflation Reduction Act in the US and policies in Europe. So complexity economics still isn't mainstream yet, but it now has some success stories.
One character that you mentioned is Kinaro. Mm-hmm. He is, of course, associated with neoclassical economic theory and the idea that the economy is in an equilibrium. But he also published this paper in 1962, which is his most cited to date, Learning by Doing, which could be understood as one way to look at increasing returns, or at least one kind of increasing returns. And so what I'm getting at is that this paper was published now about 60 years ago, and complexity did not appear just in the last 5 years. And the fact that you are calling it new economics implies that it has replaced, or at least will replace, the quote-unquote old traditional economics. So how confident are you that indeed complexity economics will eventually become mainstream? Because as you just said, it is not as we speak. Why are you confident that it will? And when do you think this will happen?
Well, I'll first just make a brief comment on Ken Arrow and his contributions, and then I'll come to your broader question about this shift in paradigm in economics. Ken was a true genius and is one of my intellectual heroes. Even though I'm a critic of neoclassical economics, when you read his seminal work with De Bro and so on, it's absolutely brilliant. The mathematics are beautiful, the ideas are insightful, and it was a huge contribution. But what's in some ways even more impressive about Ken than your average Nobel Prize winner is to continue to learn and evolve his own thinking and be curious and engage with people who had different views through his whole life. He was one of the founding figures at the Santa Fe Institute and was a mentor to figures like Brian Arthur and so on. And he made major contributions to that branch of thinking too, and even was also very self-critical of the neoclassical paradigm. Now, he was also very clear in the work that he did with Debrow in the 50s and later that was limited in what it could say about the real world. He was very conscious of the very strict assumptions and so on in theory. Others were not so conscious of that. He was always very curious about, could we find a set of ideas that didn't require this kind of abstraction from the real world, but could be more descriptive of what happens in the real world and better supported by data. Right till his final days, he was engaging with young researchers with very different and heterodox and interesting ideas. On your broader question, new economics kind of isn't my label. That sort of emerged from a community of folks and funders and so on. And I suppose it's meant to signal the idea that there is a big shift in economic thinking, both going on and is needed. But the roots of complexity economics, which, by the way, is also not my term, that was developed by Brian Arthur, go back over decades or even centuries. And you can find many precedents for the ideas in earlier thinkers, including neoliberal economists like Friedrich Hayek. Many of his ideas on economic evolution and so on actually look ahead of their time. I wouldn't agree with some of the conclusions he reached or the implications of that, but his theoretical insights have borne out very well. Or earlier thinkers than that. Marshall had some ideas that now would sound like complexity economics, for example. So there are deep historical roots. But the modern part is the fact that we have data, computers, techniques from the physical and social sciences, a ton of recent research on human behavior, human social systems, networks, machine learning techniques, all of this stuff now, which allows us to do things that these historical figures who had interesting hypotheses and insights just couldn't do. And I would say that the mainstream of economics has gone through a real shift over the past couple of decades. It was already starting to happen before the 2008 financial crisis, the behavioral economics revolution. Dissatisfaction with some of the classical ideas from the 70s and 80s was already building. 2008 crisis was also kind of a crisis for that form of economics and opened up the field to new ideas and thinking. And also the field took a very much needed empirical turn and has been much more interested in data and testing its ideas over the past couple of decades. Focused much more on kind of narrow phenomena, empirical studies and so on. And the broader shift in thinking to complexity economics is still, I would say, not yet mainstream. But as the old saying goes, science proceeds one funeral at a time. And we're seeing many more young researchers who are interested in these ideas, learning about them, open to them, and also critically adopting the new techniques. I think one of the barriers to this shift has just been a technical one, that generations of economists raised on specific kind of mathematical ideas and theories haven't made the jump to using computers in the way that's often used for this type of work. So I do believe it's happening and will likely accelerate over time as we get more of these success stories about what these ideas can contribute.
So there is a momentum, in a sense, powered by the tools and computational power. You've mentioned Friedrich Hayek. I have to mention that his Nobel lecture on the pretense of knowledge is one of my favorite academic output ever published. I think it's a masterpiece. In fact, I taught a whole course on it, so I'm big for his work. But let me come back to you, because your contribution to the field is important, and it is in your personal capacity because of the publications that you have and that we'll keep on discussing, but also because you are the executive director of the Oxford Institute of New Economic Thinking. So can you tell us about the objective of the institute, the size, the direction, or anything that you like to share around it?
Sure. Well, the Institute was also, in many ways, a product of the 2008 crisis. So before 2008, as I mentioned, these ideas have been kind of bubbling along in various places, most notably at the Santa Fe Institute. And there were also very small pockets of research, or even largely just individuals at different institutions in the US and Europe pursuing this work and making some progress. But there wasn't a real hub of this work at a major academic institution that could both provide the kind of funding and infrastructure, and also, quite importantly, the training for young scholars, PhD opportunities, postdoc opportunities. And when the 2008 crisis hit and people realized that we really do need this new kind of thinking, and in particular, policymakers needed to avoid catastrophes like we were experiencing then, that was an impetus to be able to have funding to create that kind of a center. Oxford agreed to host it. A particular reason we chose Oxford was the existence of the Oxford Martin School, which is an interdisciplinary institution within the university that pursues big projects, pulling together different departments and disciplines. Right from the beginning, I wanted to make the center interdisciplinary because that's the only way you can understand the economy, involving the best of different disciplines. And so we set up the Institute in 2012, and it's grown to the point today where it has about 120 scholars affiliated with it, drawn from 9 different academic departments and colleges across the university, a big group of DPhil students and postdocs who really provide the kind of heart of the place, and then a group of faculty who lead our research projects. We focus on both furthering the kind of foundations and theory of these ideas and techniques like agent-based modeling and network models and uses of machine learning and statistical methods. But we also have a very applied side where we're trying to work on specific problems like economic inequality, climate change, technology, innovation, role of technology in society, economic growth and development, and develop insights that are relevant to real-world problems and policymakers. And then the last thing I'd say about the Institute is we're very empirically focused. We're always asking, what's the data and evidence behind what we're doing? We feel that economics has to be grounded as an empirical science.
Let's talk about technology. Indeed, as you just mentioned, is at the center of the Institute, and it is also what powers today's complex economies. And I actually want to introduce part 2 of our conversation with a quote from you in your book that you published a couple years ago now, but that I think is still highly relevant. And I had the pleasure of reading it for the first time just a couple of weeks ago, so I'm deep into it as we speak. You write that, and I quote you here, "Companies don't innovate, markets do." What do you mean by that?
Yeah, well, one of the major themes of that book and the work at the INET Center, that the economy, it is quite literally an evolutionary system. It's not just metaphorically kind of like a biological system, or similar, but it is in fact a kind of evolutionary system. Now, it's different in many respects from the evolution we're familiar with in biology, but that the economy develops through processes of variety creation, selection from that pool of variety in an environment, and then the scaling up or scaling down of experiments that are either successful or not in that environment. And that sort of general Darwinian process applies both to what I call physical technologies, which are things like ox-drawn plows, computers, or the internal combustion engine, and social technologies, which are ways of organizing or institutions. So those can be things like money, a corporation, the rule of law. These are all ways we organize our economic and social and political activities. And when you look at history, both those kinds of technologies grow through an evolutionary process. And here, coming back to Hayek, we can ask why that is. Well, the answer actually is pretty simple. The world is so complex that we can't predict necessarily what's going to succeed in the future. There's a limit to knowledge problem, which Hayek identified. And so the only way to proceed is to experiment and try things in the world and see what works and do more of what works and less of what doesn't. And this kind of groping process of innovation is a pretty good description of both physical technology innovation and social technology innovation. So this general backdrop then leads us to a different view of what markets are and what markets do. In standard classical economics, markets are seen as an efficient way of allocating resources in society. The view I put forward in the book is actually, if you look in reality, they're not always that good at that. They're not necessarily as efficient as the economics textbooks would like us to believe. But what they are really good at is this evolutionary process of experimentation. And in one reason why market economies succeed where planned economies don't is market economies create a lot of space for variety creation and experimentation. And then markets also create a selection environment where products and services and companies that are serving some need in society attract more resources, more capital, more labor, talent, and so on, and then scale those up and then scale down the stuff that is not working or no longer needed. The markets create this kind of ferment of evolutionary activity. Now, markets are also made up of lots of institutions we call companies competing with each other in those markets. And this evolutionary process is going on inside companies too. So evolution in the economy is multi-level. It's happening at the level of the market and then also at the level inside companies. And so a company will experiment with its products and services and say, okay, how can we improve our widgets for next year? So we'll try some different widget designs, maybe test them with consumers and customers and take our best shot. We can't predict which widget will be successful next year, but we have some hypotheses and we'll put our best answer out into the market and see what works. But companies are also human institutions with bureaucracies and interests, politics, and all the other factors we're familiar with. And that often constrains the space of experimentation that they have. So you see this through corporate history where companies have a successful product and they become almost held hostage by that. And they'll tweak and do variations on the successful thing they were doing in the past, but they become risk averse and unable to branch out more broadly than that. And then when the environment and the market changes, their product is no longer successful or relevant and they go bust. And so what we see is, with few exceptions, some companies have been quite long-lived and able to adapt and change as their market has. But we also see a lot of birth and death of companies in markets. And even big successful companies that we think are going to be around forever have shorter life expectancies than we might expect. An example I like to show my students is the movie 2001, which came out in the 60s, had all these corporate logos of the future companies that seemed like they would be around when we're flying in spaceships to the moon and so on and have colonies in space. Pan Am, AT&T, and others. All those companies were gone within a couple of decades. So the basic point is that markets tend to have a bigger evolutionary field and more evolutionary dynamics than what's going on inside companies. And one of the implications of that, which I talk about in the book, is that the more companies can do to kind of bring evolution inside and let those processes run within their walls, the more likely they are to succeed over the long term, even if in the short term, it's not always the quarterly profit maximizing strategy.
So in your book, you explore those two types of technologies, the physical ones that will basically empower individuals to produce the goods and services of value for trade, and the social technologies, as you just mentioned. It's maybe the rule of law, economic transparency, anti-corruption, and so on and so forth. And those, they actually facilitate cooperation amongst non-relatives. Do we have identified already in the literature some trends as to how those two types of technologies scale differently?
Yeah, it's a great question. I wouldn't say we have necessarily firm evidence on this, or I'm not even sure anybody's kind of looked at it that specifically or in that rigorous a way. But myself and some colleagues actually wrote a piece in the journal Aeon a number of years ago where we offered some hypotheses and speculations on this. Physical technologies, as you noted on your podcast and others, often have these exponential or kind of hyper-exponential scaling laws to them. These are learning effects, innovation effects, increasing returns effects, and so on. Social technologies do seem to, they can also scale very quickly, but they do seem to, kind of sometimes hang on or be harder to change, slower to evolve. They seem to run at a different clock speed. For example, the shareholder-based corporation, the modern form of the corporation, there's been some very nice histories written of that. A lot of the key innovations came in the Industrial Revolution, mid-1800s in the UK, and some acts passed by Parliament and so on. And then that form kind of did spread actually very quickly once it became created. But then it's been relatively in a kind of stasis and hasn't changed much since, even though there have been lots of pressures on that form of corporate organization and issues with it. So we often see physical technologies kind of racing ahead of our social technologies. And we're seeing it most vividly with AI today. I think we've already seen it with social media, that technology developed at a pace which our social institutions, our laws, our kind of corporate forums, even our norms of behavior and culture kind of couldn't keep up with that pace of change. There's a quote from E.O. Wilson, another one of my heroes, which I thought summed it up very well. I won't get this exactly right, but it was roughly that we have Stone Age behaviors, medieval institutions, and godlike technologies. And that's the core of our modern problem. That illustrates that our physical technologies do have a tendency to run well ahead of our social technologies.
So in a sense, it gets even more complex, or maybe complicated in that case, because we have those godlike technologies and they change how we interact. Of course, we see that just the fact that we are recording this conversation online is a good example of what they enable. But as you also show in a different paper, and by the way, all of those will be linked in the show notes, the large-scale collaborations, they can only be sustained if the people perceive them as being fair. And you explain that it relates to relational fairness, procedural fairness, and distributional fairness. And something that came as a surprise to me is that you can actually test this different kind of fairness, which in a sense counters claims that fairness is inherently untestable. So can you elaborate on that for us?
Yeah, so I like to think of trust and fairness as kind of the dark matter of the economy, or the dark energy, whichever way you want to put it. There's the glue that holds the whole thing together. When you think about it, economies are massive cooperative structures that have scaled up from a couple of folks banging rocks together in caves to the modern global economy that we have today. We can only make complex products and services and complex technologies through massive cooperation with strangers, through supply chains and knowledge networks and markets and all the other network structures that underpin the economy. That kind of large-scale cooperation succeeds or fails on whether we can create trust and fairness so that people will not just participate in it, but participate to the best of their abilities and contribute, and also be able to take risks. So one way of telling the story of the growth of the economy and civilization is that the coevolution of physical and social technologies has enabled us to scale up these cooperative structures in a very massive way. Physical technologies play a role. So from telegraphs, telephones, communication technologies are the obvious ones. But social technologies are critical too. The rule of law is a huge innovation to allow you to trust the strangers. We're now, going through an interesting kind of dilemma where on the one hand, our physical technologies are creating cooperation at scale and speed that were once unimaginable. The technology we're using to record this conversation enables us to cooperate across time and distance in a way we couldn't have even done a decade ago. The huge supply chains that we have in the world today wouldn't exist without computers and modern communications technologies. The academic knowledge networks we're able to create are now truly global. I collaborate with people all over the world in a way, I couldn't have done even a decade ago. But at the same time, these same technologies are undermining that kind of dark matter and dark energy in the economy. And we've seen through social media the decline of trust, decline in norms of behavior and interaction, and loss of faith in key institutional structures and social technologies that underpin a lot of our economic success. So which of those forces is going to win out? The stuff that's making cooperation bigger and better, or the stuff that's destroying trust and fairness and cooperation, is a huge question for the economy and society. Now, in the paper you're referring to, one thing that I think can help is there's a terrific amount of behavioral research that gives us insights into what actually helps people see something as fair and engage in trust and cooperation, and understanding how we use technology and institutions to support those kinds of behaviors rather than undermine them is critical. And I would point to a former Oxford colleague who's now at Princeton, Molly Crockett, a psychologist who's done some fantastic work on understanding our kind of moral emotions and notions of fairness, and how things like social media and online interactions have been impacting that, which is generally not a good story.
So let's now take all of that and move to, or try to translate what it means for policymakers. And I will here introduce another paper of yours entitled Reflexivity, Complexity, and the Nature of Social Science, published in 2013, in which you make an important distinction that builds on a paper published by a very famous character, but I won't mention his name, maybe so that I don't upset some people here. But you make the distinction between the complex adaptive systems and complex reflexive systems. In adaptive systems, the agents react to one another, while the rules of the game, they remain constant, whereas in reflexive systems, even the rules of the game evolve over time. So in a sense, as you describe in the paper, reflexive systems are, and I quote you here, at the far end of the spectrum of complexity. They can be considered to be a subset of adaptive systems, but they are definitely on that end of the spectrum. How significant should the distinction be for policymakers when crafting interventions? And maybe we can take AI as an example or another field.
Yeah, I'll start with a key difference between social and economic systems and physical systems. So whether you believe in the laws of relativity or quantum mechanics or not has no impact on how the universe works. The rules are there and they're fixed. Human beliefs and expectations don't change that. All we can do is use science to try to understand those things and maybe harness them as we've harnessed quantum mechanics and semiconductor design and quantum computing and so on. Social systems are fundamentally different in that the rules of the game, the physics, are themselves human creations. The way the economy worked back in Babylonian times under one set of rules and institutions is very different than how it works today. There's an interaction then between our beliefs about the system and how it works and the rules that we have and support, and then how the system works. So if we all read Karl Marx's book and said, we believe that, and we made the Marxist economy, the economy would work in one particular way. If we all read Adam Smith's book and say, yay, that's how it should work, and we created another set of rules and system, then the system would work a very different way. So the combination of the rules of the game, which are often set by policy and policymakers and governments, and what people believe actually really matters in how the system works. And if we have a kind of wrong diagnosis of how the system is working, if economics is kind of giving us the wrong answers and the wrong policy advice, then we can create a system which doesn't work very well. So there's lots of flaws in Karl Marx's theories, and the systems created on that did not work very well, and actually, in fact, caused misery and poverty and repression for tens of millions or hundreds of millions of people. Economics kind of matters in a way that other disciplines don't, in that it helps shape our beliefs about how the system works and what the rules of the game should be. And then we also have the phenomena, and we're seeing it now with populist politics playing out in many places in the world, where people come up with stories and explanations for how the system works and how it should work, aren't based on any empirical evidence at all or understanding, but are just there to serve their own interests and power. In fact, are trying to kind of hijack the physics of the system to serve their own ends. So we believe that this paradigm shift in economics, this new economics movement, is critically important. It could lead to a much better understanding of the system and a set of rules of the game, which could help us create more cooperation and trust, address issues, economic equity and justice, address issues like climate change and other big policy challenges.
Okay, so let's take as a given that when we talk about the economy, and most likely today, if we are trying to tackle and understand the dynamics in the digital economy, we are facing at the minimum, complex adaptive system, and most of the time a complex reflexive system. But it doesn't mean that the agents within the system will just suffer from those dynamics. They can also try to influence those dynamics and produce the effects that will be convenient for the sake of achieving their own objective, which leads me to a paper that you published entitled Getting Big Too Fast, in which you tackle the very interesting question of aggressive behaviors. And by that, you mean a behavior that is aggressive in that it is trying to achieve growth at a cost of potentially survival. And you give an example. It could be that a company is heavily advertising or is trying to expand in a way that is too fast for its own capacity. And you say that on the one hand, those behaviors, they often seem to be failing because it is very difficult to predict indeed how those complex adaptive systems will evolve. But on the other hand, these markets are typically prone to very strong increasing returns, which may amplify the effect of such strategies. So what do you ultimately find? And I'm asking because when it comes to antitrust, if you find that aggressive behaviors are non-efficient because it is too hard to predict, then maybe let them go. On the other hand, if we find that increasing return will amplify those strategies, well, maybe then we need to investigate more those markets. So where do we stand when it comes to the outcome of those two contradictory trends that we observe?
I'll give a sort of slightly more general perspective on policy making. In a complex reflexive system, such as one we have to be kind of humble about our own limits to knowledge about the future. And our ability to predict the evolution of this kind of a system is very limited. We wouldn't necessarily be able to predict what the beak of the finches that Darwin observed in the Galapagos, how would those evolve a millennia from now or longer, nor can we necessarily predict how the physical and social technologies of the economy are going to evolve over the long term as well. We can make better short-term forecasts and predictions. The models I cited on the financial crisis, COVID, climate, et cetera, show that with the right techniques, we can actually make pretty decent short-term forecasts, particularly in a period when the rules of the game are relatively stable. But when you get into this reflexive dynamic where the rules and structures and technologies of the economy are all evolving too, then things become much harder to forecast. And so policymaking has to take the same lesson that I talked about for companies of kind of bringing evolution inside. So this idea that we can look at the system and come up with the optimal or ideal policy is a myth. We can use these new and better techniques to analyze the system and come up with a good set of hypotheses about what's going to be effective, whether it's in antitrust, technology policy, climate, or any other area. But we have to be willing to try things, even a variety of things, and then be very careful about collecting the evidence on what's actually working and what the impacts are. Do more of what works and less of what doesn't. If, for example, we had done that in climate change, rather than having these fights about, mythical carbon prices, which had been politically difficult, very rare, and very ineffective, we would have looked and seen that other policies that have been going on during those decades, feed-in tariffs, utility policies, industrial policies, and so on, were actually working and were actually abating carbon. And we, with a number of others, did a big study looking back on these to see that those policies were effective. If we'd taken an evolutionary approach, we would have said, that stuff is working. We can start to see why. Let's do more of that, and less of the other stuff that hasn't been working. Policymakers find it very, very hard to take this kind of evolutionary approach. Taking risks, running experiments, it makes people vulnerable to political attack. Successful evolution requires failure and requires learning from failure. And the best companies actually do this. The best companies like to fail small and succeed big and learn from failures. The best militaries also do this. My interactions with some members of the U.S. military, I was fascinated at how in-depth they study failure and learn from it. Politicians and policymakers admitting failure, let alone learning from it, seems to be a career ender. So there's this fundamental disconnect where politics and institutions resists evolution and makes it very brittle, when what we need in this kind of a world is a much more adaptive and evolutionary approach to policymaking.
And I believe this is a work for lawyers. And here we can learn from public choice theory when it comes to designing incentives for the policymakers to indeed admit failures. Because so far, if you don't have an incentive, why would you in the first place? So maybe we need a constitutional layer within those agencies to make it so that they have the incentive to document the effect of the policy, and then in case of failure, admit it and reorient the policy. Let me ask a final question. There is a saying that, it's a $1 billion question. I think here it's more of a $1,000 billion question. So if you can answer that, that will make us very rich. So I hope you can. You talked about failure within companies, and I want to ask another question on that. Your work on network shows that the large networks, they scale quickly, and more specifically, information scales quickly within those large networks, because as the number of nodes increases, the degree of connection grows exponentially. On the other end, the large networks are also prone to complexity catastrophes, where the growing number of interdependencies means that the likelihood of a positive change somewhere in the network may cascade into negative effects somewhere else in the network. And so it creates, in a way, an interesting tensions. The degree of possibility for those large networks increases, but their degrees of freedom also collapse just as quickly, because those networks don't really have the freedom to experiment and try new strategies, because if it fails, it would fail big time. What does it mean for market enforcers? Should they be concerned with ecosystems that are indeed fully integrated, or should they be more on the side of, well, collapse will come eventually, as we already discussed in our discussion today?
Yeah, so we have these two opposing forces, the benefits of scale, as you say, as networks grow, but then tendency for these networks to kind of get locked up and rigid as the interdependencies become too high. I should note this phrase, complexity catastrophe, I got from Stuart Kaufman, who wrote some interesting papers on this quite a long time ago. And in the case of companies, the primary mechanism that deals with this is actually markets. The canonical story is a company has some success and it scales up, but then it becomes a big bloated bureaucracy and experiences this kind of complexity catastrophe where you just can't do anything or change anything in the company. And eventually it loses fitness in its environment. Its products and services aren't that good or relevant anymore. It can't attract the talent and so on. And then the market deals with it and takes it out, and the resources go to someone else, and then the process repeats itself over time. So that's also coming back to my earlier comment about how often markets evolve more than individual companies. In governments and politics, it doesn't happen quite as easily or cleanly. We also see scaling up of bureaucracies and institutions in government, and they also experience this kind of complexity catastrophe where the rules become so complicated and interlocked, and also the interests, the political interests, other interests become so complex and interlocked that you literally just can't do anything. You get gridlock, and we've seen this in spades in the US and other countries. The network theorists would say the only solution when you reach that is to bust up the networks and let it reform, to reduce the interdependencies, to create the degrees of freedom where people can act and make change happen and innovate. But, that's much harder to do in a political system. Now, in theory, in a democracy, you have a kind of market-like mechanism where you get to some point of failure and the voters say, okay, I've had enough of this. I want to try something else and change something. The health of our democracies has declined, which would be a whole nother, that process also hasn't been working as well as it should. I think some deep thinking is required about, are there institutional structures that can be, or innovations that we can create that can allow this evolutionary process to work better in a governmental and policy setting, and also to help our democracies be more healthy and do their evolutionary function, and also do it in a way where we don't. One problem with a complexity catastrophe is if you don't do the kind of, if it builds up too long, then when the collapse happens, it can be quite violent and destructive. And we've seen this in history where a regime will stultify and get rigid, but hang on for a long, long time. And then when the collapse eventually comes, there's a huge amount of suffering, even violence, poverty, and so on, until things can start to, rebuild. And so you want to avoid those big crashes. So again, you want to be able to fail small and often and succeed big, not fail big.
Yeah, I think it's a good place for us to end the conversation. And thank you so much for providing a research program for the 10, 20 years ahead of us. I think those are the very interesting questions, right? Because the impact on the world may be massive if you indeed come up with such policies.
Well, there's plenty to work on and no shortage of problems to keep us busy.
Thank you so much for everything you've been publishing, for the INET Institute, and for coming on the podcast. I've been looking after you for quite some time, and it's a real pleasure. I know we'll come back to our conversations many times. So on that note, to everyone out there, take care of yourself, and if you can, someone else too. Bye-bye.